And joining us in the studio now, royal broadcaster and historian Rafe Heydel-Mankoo. It's lovely to see you. It's everybody watching, I think, can't make up their minds why they're so upset today. It's just an anniversary. You forget how much you were upset a year ago, don't you?
Well, actually, it's rather good now that we can look back after 12 months because, you know, our emotions are a bit more settled and we do have perspective. And actually, we are mourning a loss because, you know, the Queen was the great matriarch of Britain and of the Commonwealth. And, of course, she wasn't just in our lives for 70 years. She was in the public eye for 96 years. And we tend to view history in terms of centuries, and our collective memory works in centuries. So for our entire collective memory, the Queen was a constant. And she wasn't just a constant in British life, but in the Commonwealth and around the world. She was the premier symbol of constancy in the world when everything else seemed to change so much. That's why we're feeling like this. You know, the world's most reproduced figure, you know, in terms of stamps, coins, money in the Commonwealth countries as well as here. Her image was the most recognisable person in the world, the most photographed person in the world. So we're mourning that. And I think we will never, ever see again an event of such historic significance that was able to conjure up and churn the emotions of Britain and the Commonwealth. You know, we look back in the past and we always reference Churchill's funeral, the coronation of 52, VE Day, with Battle of Waterloo, the death of Nelson. This takes its place with those events, and I can't really see any other event in the future coming quite close to that.
No. I'll tell you what I was struck by in the King's recorded message, that he talks about, you know, how she meant so much to so many of us. And in a way, even now, he has to allow people into his grief. He has to share his mother in that way, putting himself in the same bracket as us, which almost seems a little bit unfair on him.
Yes, well, it's a very bittersweet day, Accession Day, because, of course, we're not just marking the first anniversary of the death of the Queen, but also of the accession.
But she must have had to go through this.
Well, this is what interesting. You know, so the royal family used to have extreme periods of mourning. If this were Victorian times, today would have been the first day out of mourning. It was 1 year of mourning for Queen Victoria. It was 6 months for George V, the Queen's grandfather. The Queen's father, George VI, had a 16-week period of mourning. But whilst all of that's modernised, one constancy that the King has retained is to spend Accession Day having a moment of personal reflection in private in the place that his mother died. Now, the Queen spent her first Accession Day at Sandringham, where her father died, and almost every Accession Day after that was spent at Sandringham. And I think it's quite telling that the King has chosen to go to Balmoral, where his mother died, rather than stay at Birkhall, which he far prefers and which the current Queen far prefers. And I think it's telling that even though we hear that he wants to become a reforming monarch, this is a way of saying, I'm going to carry on traditions, I'm going to symbolise continuity, and things haven't changed that much.
Where were you when you heard that she'd died?
I was waiting at home and then came in as soon as I was on call, basically.
It was
a day of mixed messages, but once the palace always underplays everything, and once they said doctors are very concerned, for those of us in the know, we knew basically, you know, get your shoes on and get ready.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. There's a piece in the Daily Mail today about the fact that soldiers had to be called back from places as distant as Iraq and Canada because apparently the official pallbearers had been trained for such an event, and they were on their way to Canada. They finished their flight to Canada, turned around and came straight back. And things like that. Everybody had to be called in quite suddenly, although they must have sensed that things would soon be necessary.
Well, this was the thing. I mean, you know, as we all know, this has been in the planning for decades. Many people have retired who've been on the planning of this. But even so, no one expected things to happen so quickly. We remember the photograph with Liz Truss. It was later that day that things took a turn for the worse. Everyone thought perhaps it will be several weeks, maybe even 6 months that the Queen had left. The speed with which things took place took everyone off guard, so even the best laid plans don't mean that you're necessarily prepared for the moment. But actually, I think it was the Queen's last gift to the Union also to die in Scotland, because by dying at Balmoral and then going to Holyrood House Palace for the family and servants to pay respects, then that procession to St Giles Cathedral for the lying in state, and then the procession down to England, I think that was a wonderful wonderful way to remind us all that she was the Queen of the entire nation. And just adding those things in made it the grandest funeral the country has ever seen, far grander than Queen Victoria's or even of Churchill's.
Really?
Every monarch was always buried at had their funeral at St George's, Windsor. The Earl Marshal chose to have the Queen's funeral at Westminster Abbey, the first since King George II in 1760. Oh. And that's why we were able to have a far grander occasion than for any other monarchs. This funeral, I think, was the grandest in British history.
Yeah. Well, and of course there was the lying in state as well, and the queues and queues of people.
Yeah, I think that, nothing could be more fitting than the longest queue in history for the longest...
Very British, isn't it?
For the longest reign in history. But I think that really showed us that, despite what we hear about traditional Britain being dead and passé, it's still alive and well, and we saw that in that 10-mile queue. People queuing for 17-odd hours.
What do you make of this picture from 1968 that the King has released to remember his mother? Because it's interesting that he's chosen this time when she was 42. I mean, it's a phenomenal picture.
It's a wonderful
there you
picture
go.
By my favourite photographer. I think that the best raw photographer of all time, Sir Cecil Beaton, who was the Queen Mother's favourite photographer. And he was always able to combine majesty and grandeur with a softness and a warmth. And I think that's encapsulated. It reminds me very much of the 1955 Antigone portrait, if you may remember, where she looks rather more severe and majestic.
Well,
but
don't you
still
think
wearing
that's
the
why...
mantle of the Order of the Garter and Grand Duchess Vladimir's tiara as well.
For anyone listening on the radio, if you haven't seen the picture yet, she's got a little wry smile and a twinkle in her eye. And I would think that's probably why they didn't release it at the time, because they probably released a much more sombre version of the same portrait.
Yes, although this was on display at the National Portrait Gallery.
But not...
It wasn't publicly released, but I think it wonderfully captures her spirit, because we know that twinkle... Well, I think we've seen from sources, it's the twinkle in her eye that's the reason that they chose this.
Yeah, it's lovely.
It's a lovely
picture.
Yeah.
Rafe, as always, it's good to see you. Thank
Pleasure.
you very much indeed.
Yeah.
Keep your thoughts coming through. Linda in Barry says there should definitely be a statue of the Queen in every city in the UK, not just London. Doesn't feel like she's gone. I'm with you on that, Linda. I think in terms of memorials and things, really, certainly in every major city, there should be a statue of her. I think that'd be a lovely thing to do.
And I like that portrait would make a nice statue.
It would be a wonder.
With those
that would be wonderful.
robes, yeah, but with a slightly younger face than we remember in frequent years.
But as someone suggested last weekend, actually, a different statue, statues through the ages for the Queen in different parts of the country would be lovely.
Every city could actually choose how they wanted to represent her in a statue. What sort of age, what sort of clothing, what sort of thing she was saying. But anyway, we're paying tribute, obviously, today, because it's something I think we're all thinking about. And as many people have already pointed out, it's a day when you remember your own mum, and you also remember other people you've loved and lost. But, hopefully in a joyous way as well. So do get your thoughts in, won't you? GBviews@gbnews.com.